If we look at the organic chemist's periodic table, it will help us determine the common bonding patterns of the most common atoms that we're going to see in organic chemistry. And so if we look at hydrogen, hydrogen has one valence electron because it's in group 1 of the periodic table. Carbon is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 valence electrons. Nitrogen is going to have 5, oxygen 6, and fluorine is going to have 7. And so we know that the goal of the octet rule is 8 shared electrons total. So on its own, each of these atoms don't have the full valence shell. And so what they're going to want to do, they're going to want to bond to another atom, and that bond, those bonds are going to allow it to achieve its octet. And so in the case of hydrogen, it only needs a duet, and so it's going to need one bond in order for it to achieve that octet. So that's going to look like hydrogen with one bond. Now, for carbon, it's going to need 4 bonds for it to achieve its octet. Nitrogen's going to need 3 bonds. So we're going to have a lone pair, 3 bonds. Oxygen is going to need 2 bonds. And then finally, fluorine is going to need 1 bond. So this is important because we're going to move beyond being able to kind of count the valence electrons and see how many atoms will need a bond or 2 or 3 or what have you. And instead, we're going to recognize these common bonding patterns. So if I see, for instance, carbon with 3 bonds, I know, and that it's neutral, I know that there's something wrong with this because the neutral carbon has 4 bonds to it. So that means it's either going to be a carbon with a positive charge or a carbon with a negative charge, but if it's neutral, it has to have 4 bonds to it. Nitrogen is the same thing, and it needs 3 bonds in order for it to be 3 bonds and a lone pair for it to be neutral. Oxygen, if I give you oxygen with just 1 bond, we know that it's not going to be a neutral oxygen. It's going to be negatively charged. We'll talk about the bonding patterns later, as well as formal charge. But for now, you want to get comfortable recognizing that for carbon in its neutral form, it's going to have 4 bonds around it. For nitrogen in its neutral form, it's going to have 3 bonds in a lone pair. Oxygen is going to have 2 lone pairs and 2 bonds in its neutral form. Fluorine or any of the halides are going to have 1 bond and 3 lone pairs around it. And then hydrogen, to get its duet, it's only going to have 1 bond. So these are the common bonding patterns. Another common bonding pattern is the bond that you and I will share by liking, commenting, and subscribing to the OChem Master on YouTube.